Dome Keeper is a survival game developed by small German indie studio Beepin Beats, founded by René Habermann and his wife Anne Ecker. On a soundtrack by Cameron Paxton, it features a rather secretive character sent to a planet to collect its resources while protecting themselves from creatures who regularly attack this mysterious intruder. It was during Game Jam Ludum Dare number 48 on the theme Deeper and Deeper, held from April 24 to 27 in 2021, that Dome Keeper was born under the very sweet name of Dome Romantic. Development continued and the game was released in September 2022. The developers have been very active ever since, updating the game regularly, both in terms of balancing, notably for one of the playable characters, the enigmatic assessor, and the latest domes that were implemented, and content. 2 domes were added recently, and there might be other game modes, including a multiplayer and even a pacifist mode where we could colonize the planet. Of course, in this video, I can only talk about the content available at the time of publication. Other game modes could bring a new perspective to the analysis, in which case I'll add a few ideas in the comment section. While Dome Keeper has a limited scope, this is obviously not a criticism, I very much appreciate its narrative. All the artistic elements, often based on the idea of opposition, of duality, bring a lot of depth to the character of the Keeper, torn between greed and loss of meaning as they embark on a mission that isolates them from everything. Martin Fall's sound design notably is exemplary, and Cameron Paxton's soundtrack sublimates some of the game's themes, illustrating the work on time and space and showing what the game seems to be hiding from us, revealing the emotions of the 2 seemingly anonymous playable characters, small silhouettes entirely dedicated to their mission: protect the dome. In Dome Keeper, we play as a worker sent to a planet in order to mine its resources. As we arrive on the planet at full speed, we kill a defenseless creature, barely enough time to understand what's happening to it before the dome crushes it. It's not the most peaceful of landings, and it doesn't get any better as we immediately get down to our task, digging the planet's underground to collect its precious ore. I do like the Abort Proceed translation on the first selection screen, very relevant for a mission. I don't know if it's an addition compared to the German version, but it hasn't been kept in the French localization, which uses a more neutral vocabulary. There are 2 goals depending on the game mode. In Relic Hunt, we have to find a relic hidden in the deepest part of the mine and bring it up to the dome where it can protect us from the last brutal attack of the planet's creatures. The Prestige mode is a scoring mode with several variants available. We have to send materials back to the planet that dispatched us here while the dome is still standing. For, as the name suggests, whichever mode you choose, the goal is to keep this protection, the dome, intact. In response to our sensational and deadly entry onto this planet and the intensive exploitation of its resources, the creatures that inhabit this world attack our dome in waves, the difficulty of which will adapt to a certain number of parameters. I'll come back to this point later. We therefore alternate tirelessly between mining phases and tower defense phases, with the management side since we can upgrade our equipment and our dome using the mined resources. On top of this, we can discover multiple gadgets in the biomes, some requiring a specific place in the dome, others passive, found in small caves. It's all part of an overall roguelike or roguelite mechanics, as each run brings us back at the beginning of the Keeper's adventure. If we fail, we can choose to keep a gadget if we've obtained one to start a new run, in which case it's technically a roguelite. If we refuse, it's a roguelike, we have to do everything all over again. Nevertheless, on the roguelike and roguelite spectrum, we're much closer to a roguelike, where each run can be seen and felt as independent of the others, whereas some roguelites, such as Hades or Rogue Legacy 2, will take advantage of repeated runs to unlock weapons or skills permanently, allowing the playable character to become more powerful and possibly offering a certain richness in terms of story as you multiply the runs in the case of Hades. There are 2 playable characters, the Engineer and the Assessor, and 4 domes: Laser, the first playable dome and the easiest to learn, Sword, Artillery, and Tesla. Whereas combat is identical for both playable characters, so the feel of the fight depends solely on the dome you choose, the mining phases are very different depending on whether you choose the engineer or the assessor. Because of Dawnkeeper's graphic style, the playable characters have relatively little detail on their in-game sprite, though they do have a more detailed artwork on their respective soundtrack. Both are anonymous, they have no first or last name and we never see their face. They are referred to by their mission, Keeper, then by a profession, shall we say, at least a form of status, engineer and assessor. We can't really call them impassive since their features are not visible, but it's amusing to see the character frantically typing at their workstation in the laser dome. It's the only visual element that could bring us, but not even remotely close to their state of mind. The first playable character, the engineer, most embodies the laborious aspect of the mission. They're extremely pleasant and easy to handle, destroying tiles automatically depending on the direction they're moving. No input is required. Tool-oriented, they move with a jetpack, have a portable drill to patiently destroy each rock, and pick up resources using cables. In some artworks, information appears on their helmets, a diegetic equivalent of the UI upgrades that can be unlocked: a life bar, a wave timer, a prospecting meter. They're a very down-to-earth character, one might say, who can apprehend the mine thanks to a very clear system. Because of the visibility of the ore in the rock, one of the techniques when digging is to make rows. You dig one row, leave two intact, then dig another. For deeper levels, where ore deposits are larger, you can dig one row, leave three intact, and so on. This might not be the most efficient method, but it is very simple to execute and illustrates the rational side of mission implementation, the patient work of the engineer. The assessor, the expert, is more mysterious as they don't look human at all, although the engineer might very well not be after all. You can see their rather strange neck and legs, and they use a kind of electromagnetic field to levitate both themselves and kinetic spheres, which they can send flying onto the rock, destroying it from a distance. Resources are harvested in a similar way, levitating close to the assessor, who can even propel them towards the dome. In contrast to the easy-to-learn engineer, who seems to grasp their new environment with simplicity, if not blindness, the assessor requires a little more care when choosing which rocks to destroy. They have a different eye on the mine. It's no longer a question of physical strength, but of thought, both in the way the assessor moves and interacts with the rocks and resources, and in the decisions they have to make to dig efficiently. On the other hand, their gameplay immediately takes a more spectacular approach, with the bouncing spheres musically illustrated in Caves Beyond and the sound design when gathering resources. The gameplay of each keeper emphasizes a different strength. The engineer is precise in the sense that they know perfectly where they're going, which block they're destroying. They master space in a sense, but can only do one thing at a time, whereas the assessor masters, in addition to space, time. As they can fairly quickly own several kinetic spheres, they can move to reveal another area of the mine, while the first sphere destroys all the blocks, a form of ubiquity, but the perhaps lesser accuracy of their mining rather brings out their ability to do several things at once, thus emphasizing their mastery of time. The assessor's multitasking potential is quite impressive. They can possess up to 7 spheres, which means they can technically dig in 7 different places at the same time while they dig the rock themselves. They're less efficient, but they can compress the rock without using the spheres. And as they can send resources to the dome from the beginning of a run without having to carry them there by hand, unlike the engineer, they don't waste time going back and forth. Add to these gadgets, such as the lift or drillbert, as well as the techniques associated with the spheres, and you get a gameplay that's certainly more complex to get to grips with, but extremely versatile, softening the keeper's mission a little by turning the mine into a playground. Besides, the assessor's techniques don't have that hard-working feel you might find with the engineer. They don't break rock directly, nor do they touch the resources or bother carrying them, suggesting a certain distance from their work. Perhaps, deep down, the keepers are both masters of time and space, each in their own way. The engineer is precise, orderly, their rhythm is regular, they know exactly where they're going. The assessor is whimsical, spectacular, their mastery makes life easier, and they dig to the rhythm of the spheres, irregular by nature. They bring a bit of disorder on the planet. The dome centralizes everything in the game. It's where you work and live even though you never rest. It's the reason why creatures die at the very beginning, and it's also where the resources are destroyed, becoming the sole property of the keeper, making the dome the area that focuses all enemy resentment. It is therefore at the center, almost literally, of the space, at the intersection of the screen's axes of symmetry and anti-symmetry. Vertical axis symmetry because everything works the same, left and right. Enemies attack the dome symmetrically. The laser dome can be upgraded to 2 completely symmetrical lasers. Mining is done starting from the center. And anti-symmetry because the 2 parts of the planet, the surface and the mine, are a negative of the other. One can be completely explored, the other will never be seen other than through the dome, the third space. The mine itself is almost a little paradoxical since, although associated with work, it's here that the keeper spends most of their time and collects the ore, which is the reason why they've been sent here. It's the place that embodies a form of rest, at least tranquility, a psychological rest, so to speak. But this place of respite, the underground, isn't immediately accessible in the sense that you have to dig to get there little by little. It has to reveal itself, whereas the surface is directly visible through the transparent dome. Danger doesn't hide, as suggested in a beautiful artwork from the developers. There's also a nice contrast between the huge mine, which can be freely explored by the keeper, and the tiny dome, rather fragile, at least at the start of the run, which nevertheless allows us to control the entire space of the creatures through weapons. The dome's small interface between the 2 spaces ultimately allows us to invade the entire planet, directly when we dig and indirectly through weapons, their range and their power. All movements are therefore organized in relation to it. Everything starts from it and is directed towards it. Each dome also has its own gameplay through its weapon. The laser is very easy since it has a single gameplay and above all an infinite range. All the creatures are killed the same way, even though you have to adapt to each enemy's behavior, whereas the other weapons can and must be used in several ways, even with several types of ammunition, but they will require more dexterity. Just like the keepers, the domes have their own relationship to space and time. In particular, the Tesla dome reminds me of the Assessor in that you can have several active zones on the screen at the same time, and you can charge the reticle while it's moving, reminiscent of the Assessor's multitasking. The Artillery dome requires us to anticipate enemy movements since the ammunition is slow, and once launched, you can't change its trajectory. They're also very well characterized with their own shape, control station and interior, and notably an extremely precise sound signature related to the resource grinder. Inside the Sword dome it almost looks and sounds like a monster eating resources, while the Artillery dome is focused on liquid. The Tesla dome is interesting in that it creates a form of imbalance for the keeper. During the combat phases, the capsule therein is launched to the top of the dome, opening it in 2 and generating the magnetic field. This contrasts with the others, which always keep the keeper inside, sheltered. We can already glimpse the duality of the game, constantly oscillating between technology and magic, patience and ease, toil and spectacular, as each element seems to find its positive or negative counterpart, its opposite. There are 2 phases, 2 spaces, 2 keepers. We alternate between freedom and constraint, safety and danger, proximity and distance, accessible and inaccessible. The creatures themselves have 2 faces. The repetitive nature of their attacks can suggest blindness, bringing down the dome at all costs without really being aware of what it can do, and sometimes using their own body or even their head to hit. But we'll see later that the wave generation system gives them a form of organization of reactivity faced with an invasion. In fact, to these enemies will answer other non-hostile creatures which can even be quite amusing. Some are actually gadgets, Trilbert and Squidley, while others, non-interactive, appear as you start emptying the mine. Plants also grow on the remaining blocks, discreetly livening up this rather austere area. But if you give in to greed and destroy all the blocks, creatures and plants disappear as the latter grow with difficulty on the edges of the mine. Here again you can keep or destroy. The keeper is isolated but beset by enemies to fight, surrounded by flora and fauna that they can nevertheless destroy with a single hit, sheltered in a dome that amplifies the slightest blow, the slightest vibration caused by their opponent, we'll come back to this, an admittedly imperfect protection that hides nothing of what they're subjected to and in which, a final duality, the keeper at their control station never looks at those attacking them. But despite these many oppositions, if there's one thing the two keepers have in common, it's loneliness, and we can well imagine that the keeper isn't going to cope very well with these dualities, especially as they're subjected to different timescales. The little keeper finds themselves desperately alone on a seemingly unknown planet on which neither they nor their dome are welcome, but where they have to settle for quite some time. We see that time goes by, seasons seem to pass, things happen such as rainfalls, snowfalls or meteor showers. The planet leaves, time flows by, our mission seems endless. Depending on the settings, a run can easily last several hours in prestige mode, reinforced by the lack of pause between cycles as if we never slept. Even in Moonlighter, we rest for a few minutes between a dungeon to explore at night and a store to run during the day. This is understandable, though as the game is made up of very short cycles, this kind of break wouldn't make much sense. We can thus see that two timescales are superimposed, that of the planet and its likely seasons, the long time, a time however only suggested, and that of the player, the short, even very short time, that of the cycles. It's the time we feel the most, given that it's the time of the gameplay, and it's also the one that most highlights one of the game's themes, greed. The playable character, however, seems strangely caught between these two scales. By superimposing gameplay sequences lasting from a few seconds to a few minutes on an imaginary time supposedly much longer, probably counting in weeks, months, years perhaps, the game accentuates the loss of temporal bearings of a keeper torn between the urgency of returning to their dome before the enemy strikes and the weariness of a long, repetitive mission, a loss of bearings that could evolve into a loss of meaning. In the first three difficulty modes, normal, hard, brutal, we start with a mining phase of just over a minute, after which it's time for combat. But we're not immediately confronted with anything particularly challenging. The first waves are made up of just one or two enemies. It's short, like a simple disturbance, a brief interruption in our quest for resources and relics. A waste of time in a way. You have to pay attention to the timer, go back up, sit at your station while choosing one or more upgrades, kill the creature, and dive again. But you have to do it because, unlike us, creatures have complete control over time. Since they can't attack us directly, their target is our dome, the cause of their misfortunes, the loss of their fellow creatures, and our farming their planet's resources. As we've seen, it concentrates every reason they have to resent us. All movements are therefore directed towards it. Some enemies are small, like the ticks, kamikazes, who hurl themselves against the glass and do little damage, while others remain in the air to bombard the shelter. Sometimes they settle down to strike the dome without respite, or even simply drill it. The Rockman's attacks get faster and faster. They are perfectly capable of punching the dome until it disintegrates in a shower of glass. You have to be aggressive and eliminate the enemies quickly, since they have no time constraints, except for the ticks and big ticks, who die throwing themselves against the dome. That's when greed is most apparent. As enemies approach, it's best to climb back up, or the more so at the beginning when you don't have a teleporter and your speed is limited. One resource too many and the keeper becomes far too slow to get back to the dome in time. In fact, it's amusing to hear the sound of resources being crushed lower rapidly as we dive away from the dome. Not that this effect is specific to the game, of course, simply it epitomizes the absence of respite, the need to dive back into the mine again and again. The more resources and gadgets we collect, the more of a threat we appear to the creatures, and the waves become spaced out but intensify, as if our enemies were preparing longer to attack us in a more sustained and organized fashion. Although their attacks are quite brutal, almost blind for some of the enemies, the game gives them a form of intelligence, a responsiveness via the weight system. The number and difficulty of the enemies in a wave is adapted not only according to the amount of resources already mined, notably gadgets, but also according to our performance in the previous wave. If we've taken a lot of damage, the next wave will be easier, as if the creatures were adapting to our level and greed, studying us as a threat to themselves and to the planet. On the other hand, in Relic Hunt, once said relic has been found, the last wave is particularly tough, a last attempt to prevent us from completing the mission. We can get through on our own, but once our life is down to 0, a bomb eliminates all remaining enemies in a quite literal laser party. The dome is saved. In case of defeat, the dome explodes and we instantly disappear along with the dome's upper floor, the aerial part. It's the dome that's important, we're just its keeper. However, an artwork by the developers seems to suggest that we are teleported probably back to our home planet, while the creatures still alive turn back and leave immediately. The dome is destroyed, it's all that matters. In parallel with the increasing difficulty of the waves of enemies, our equipment gains in power. In a video made for Save and Sound several days, during which composers and sound designers each present for around 10 minutes an iconic moment from a soundtrack or their sound design expertise, Cameron Paxton broke down one of the tracks from the Engineer's soundtrack, Laser Party, when we win a run with the Engineer. One element that caught my attention was the idea that the composer wanted to convey the feeling of wear and tear of something on its way out, to quote the composer. So the sound of the drums is heavily filtered.
You can hear when I take this off, it has a lot more of a natural drum sound to it. So a lot of that texture and feeling comes from the bit crushing.
And it's true, the dome at first is very basic, both as a place to live and as a place to work and fight. The engineer's equipment is just as limited at the start of the run. Movement and drilling are very slow. In fact, the drill they're using doesn't even seem to have a power supply. But this impression is turned around thanks to the upgrades. Nothing seems to impede the characters' movements anymore. They can blast significant areas of the mine, and combat becomes more and more spectacular, especially with the Tesla dome. What used to be a minor interruption between two mining phases, a modest face-off between a not-so-fast enemy and a somewhat weak and rickety weapon, becomes a more concrete and sustained battle on both sides of the dome. One could almost think that a phase's weight is inverted between mining and tower defense. Surviving the enemies becomes paramount. The accumulation of resources helps to organize the confrontation, a war of attrition, while an increasing number of more powerful creatures attack the dome in small successive waves. They don't spawn all at the same time, so you feel the tension more. Sometimes you're really waiting for the final sound signal, especially as you encounter the toughest and most impressive beasts. On the other hand, the dome as a living space will remain largely unchanged. Only a pet will eventually join us in an attempt to recreate a living space in this tiny workplace where most of the space is devoted to machines. The use of the relic may raise the question of its usefulness to us. It's not very clear whether the relic is destroyed or not when the bomb is triggered. If it's destroyed after use, then it's not essential to bring it back to our planet, or if it was, then we haven't really won. At the very least, the mission hasn't been completed. Unlike the scoring mode in Relic Hunt, resources don't matter for our home planet, only the relic. Why should our likely return, or at least the end of the mission, be determined by an item that is almost inevitably destroyed, the last wave being systematically very difficult, whatever the percentage of resources collected? What is the point of the Keeper's mission in this case, apart from keeping? If the relic is not destroyed after the bomb has been used, then what happens next? Once the creatures have been eliminated, the Keeper remains sitting at the station, unperturbed, while the victory screen appears. More generally, what is the goal of the Keeper? Collect resources? They are consumed as soon as they are brought into the dome and not sent back to the planet in relic hunt mode. Kill the creatures? Even if our landing and the overall mission comes at the expense of many of them, that doesn't seem to be our mission's true objective. Finding the relic, then. No one knows what the Keeper will do with it. It is, however, very clearly staged. A layer is triggered when we begin to unlock it, and from the moment we bring it back, all the musics are fixed. The ascent, when we see the relic pulsating almost as if it were alive, then the tension of the last wave and the release of victory. The relic guides the entire endgame, since the last wave is automatically triggered as soon as we bring it up to the dome. The loneliness of the playable character, except for their little pets, the laborious nature of their work, at least for the engineer, is reflected in the sound design. There is no vocal sound design, only work counts. In the case of the engineer in particular, our exploration of the mine is set to the rhythm of stones being destroyed, a sound which finds its more poetic counterpart in the sound design of the materials using definite pitches. It's almost musical, a first form of sonic reward, just like the gadget fanfare that slightly brightens the cycles without music. Their sound design uses slightly different pitches, suggesting that there's nothing mineral about them, unlike the resources which can even grow on trees, granting them a vegetal nature. The sonic staging, so to speak, of the mining is perfect in its duality, rhythm and pitch. The creatures on the planet aren't more talkative. There's nothing contemplative about the way each of them, keeper or creature, looks at the other. It's all about combat, which isn't aesthetically pleasing at all. On the contrary, everything contributes to making it quite oppressive. Although the creatures are mostly zoomorphic, some are reminiscent of gorillas, deer or stingrays, their sound design is rarely so. It's usually when they die that we hear more vocal elements, most of the sound effects being dedicated to their attacks, although some have a sort of intimidation scream. However, just as their appearance recalls animals or even humans for the walkers, without depicting them entirely as such, their sound design is considerably altered and this vocal aspect remains limited, all the more strange in that it is modified by the dome itself. All the sound effects seem to be heard from the keeper's point of view, with the distortion and especially the vibrations due to the material of which the dome is made. Everything is transmitted through the glass, which gives us an unobstructed view of the danger, while fundamentally amplifying it. One last element highlighting the sound design is the silence, since there is no music during the waves, emphasizing the violence at work on both sides of the dome. During the most advanced phases, our weapons show just as much violence as the planet's inhabitants, both visually and orally. The sound design of the dome is quickly engraved into our mind, whether it's the continuous hum of the laser, the back and forth of the sword, its cutting edge or the charge after a stab, the ammunition of the artillery dome, or the electro orbs of the Tesla dome. Even when there are few enemies, most of them attack the dome without stopping, which can be very oppressive, especially if you're late and hear them attacking the dome while you're still getting back to the shelter, underlining once again the importance of time and greed. To be precise, when I say silence, it's not quite that but this is the case in the vast majority of games, there's always an atmos layer specific to each biome from the mine. It's a little more perceptible in the first biome and when you enter the dome. Even in Inside, that famous moment when the point of view changes and the non-diegetic music and all the sound effects disappear, as if we were being observed through a window or a one-way mirror by one of the scientists, there's still a rather heavy ambient layer. We also hear a discrete layer triggered near the Relix switches, similar to the Relix actual ambient layer. Music generally only appears during some of the mining phases. Only the last wave of enemies, after the relic has been brought back, is accompanied by music. Its outcome is certain, victory is assured, and this is the only time when music will convey the feeling of anxiety directly connected to the attack. Once the creatures have been defeated, after a few seconds of silence, the hero returns to the depths, and their mind can finally, for a moment, let go as they empty, rock by rock, the various biomes of the mine. There is also very specific management of the silence within Cameron Paxton's score, which I will develop in the following section. Just as the game superimposes different time scales, so it superimposes different scales of silence, reflecting the keeper's difficulty experiencing the mission and making it their own. Since an update, you can choose the frequency at which the music appears. More precisely, you can choose the number of cycles without music. Previously it was fixed. And after testing several settings, it really changes the experience. When you decrease the frequency of the music, you really feel that idea of sonic reward again, all the more so when the enemies get tougher. That mix of relief and concern to which the hero could sometimes give in, but not always, because they wouldn't really have the mental space for it, consumed by worry about the next fight. Indeed, as the character is perfectly silent, it's through the music that emotions are most clearly expressed, and as the two playable characters don't have the same design or gameplay at all, which suggests a different background and personality, they each have their own OST. You can, however, choose which OST will accompany your run. You can play the engineer with their soundtrack or the assessors and vice versa, or even use both OSTs at the same time. Given that some runs can easily last several hours, you may want to vary the mood. Each OST is, however, closely associated with its playable character and is obviously an integral part of the characterization. As I began to prepare the script for this video, I found myself comparing the use of silence and music to potion craft, which also relies on the absence of vocal sound design. As we play a potion merchant, and since the requests of some of our customers are rather dishonest, to put it mildly, there's a form of secrecy in this profession. We create potions and sell them to whoever wants them. Judgment is possible since we can refuse to serve a customer, but neither we nor they possess any vocal sound design, underlining both the graphic style, of course, and the restraint we must keep in our trade. Only potions matter, proofs of our talent and expertise. The crafting sound design is therefore very meticulous, a delicious but discreet ASMR of crushing plants and utensils. The use of music, on the other hand, uninterrupted, is different. It embodies the surface, the facade, the kindness, a priori, of all the customers, in addition to the playable character, even those with the darkest intentions, who can bring the devil right into our shop. In Dawnkeeper, its use and significance go much deeper. Of course, the relative silence and the fact that the music doesn't loop is logically related to the rhythm of the game. As I mentioned earlier, the gameplay phases are very short, a little more than a minute for the first mining phases and a few seconds for the first combat phases. Changing the music just for a few moments would not be very effective. The musics for the mining phases all last around 2 minutes, which is almost the actual average duration of one of these phases. It's even a little too long for the first cycles. If the wave starts before the music is theoretically over, the music fades out so that we don't hear it during combat, further stressing the idea that we are interrupted in our cycle, in our thoughts. The combat silence illustrates a form of fear, as we now have to face the reality of the danger of our mission. Without music, we are entirely focused on combat. It's only at the end of a wave that we can finally return to the depths, which are perhaps more welcoming, more protective at least than the surface, and enjoy a few moments of respite. Then, sometimes, the keeper gives in and the music starts again. What's more, Cameron Paxton's music almost makes explicit what the game can't really show us. Physically, it's the space, the depth of this mine whose dimensions can be impressive. In these two spaces, the surface and the underground, in two dimensions, treated as we've seen as negatives of each other, but both suffering the same fate, emptied of their resources and inhabitants, and linked by the common symmetry, reinforcing their flat, two-dimensional character, Cameron Paxton manages to add a third physical dimension as his music possesses the sonic depth that the game graphically has not or very little thanks to the parallax in the little caves containing some of the gadgets, and another third dimension, another depth that we can only guess at, what's going on inside the keeper's head. The notion of dimension in music, and more specifically the suggestion of the depth of the sonic space, is quite dear to me as it's something I've encountered relatively little in classical music, although there can be occasional spatialization. The examples I have most in mind are found in Baroque music or even earlier. For example, the two tenors in response in the Gloria Patri from the Magnificat of Monteverdi's Vespers for the Blessed Virgin, that's a very long sentence, and in contemporary music. At the Conservatoire, we played a flute quartet, Jeu de Miroir by Joanna Rotaru, in which each flutist was placed in a corner of the room. There are other examples, of course, but for the repertoire I listened to the most, essentially symphonic or concertante, there was rarely any emphasis on distance or depth, so I'm often drawn to choices based on the management of the sonic space. In my analysis of the Hollow Knight OST, I highlighted the fine work on the sound planes in the fungal wastes, notably the different levels of reverb, creating a sonic equivalent of the different levels of blur in the parallax, and the echo, notably on the small rhythmic percussion cells, which suggested the reflection of the sound on the cavern walls, an effect found again in Crystal Peak with the guitar harmonics at the beginning of the loop. Christopher Larkin makes concrete the physical volume of this immense, particularly vertical zone. In Bayonetta Origins, Syriza and the Lost Demon, the music of Avalon Forest also uses echo effects to suggest the vastness of a place unknown to the young witch, and this sense of the unknown is reflected in the physical distance that can be felt, as if the music were coming from the forest. The other musics, played by the quintet, are more associated with Syriza's feelings, a story, her fear too, her relationship with Cheshire in more tender moments, right down to the short success or collectibles fanfares. The quintet brings a very tangible, concrete side to the sound with a touch of emphasis at times through its very classical sound. In the forest, we get the feeling that the source of the music is further away, an almost physical distance in keeping with Cerisa's psychological distance from the places she explores with the more or less faithful demon. It's also an adaptive music with 5 different versions depending on the relationship between the two characters. It also illustrates the merveilleux. It must be a little intriguing, a little distant, not entirely concrete, almost elusive. The instrumentalists lose their materiality, whereas in the quintet's music, it's much easier to picture the ensemble playing. In Whispering Path, it's also amusing to hear the clarinet move from ear to ear, as if it were circling the duo, observing them from afar, probably up to no good. On the other hand, once Cheshire obtains a power, the mystery temporarily disappears with a new adventure awaits. The game is extremely clear about what is unknown or not to Cerisa and translates this into a game on the distance between the player and the source of the sound. It's worth noting that the Switch remake of Link's Awakening doesn't use this distance in the mysterious forest, unlike the fairy fountains or the caves, for example. Perhaps to distinguish what's happening outside from what's happening inside in the caves. The fairies may be outside, but they have a definite function. And they're fairies after all. In the first chapter of Jusant, Daymark, Amer in French, the sound of the piano is very close. We can hear the noises of the mechanism, which can refer to very intimate things. These musics, simple and soft, appear just as we discover the first places that used to be inhabited at the very bottom of the tower. The game has in part a contemplative dimension and invites us to explore a formerly inhabited place, or what seems to be no more than the memory of this place that we would have abandoned, as it were, leaving everything there. On the other hand, other pieces attempt to fill the sonic space to convey a sense of immensity and vertigo, nuanced by the absence of game over. Many layers suggest the ebb and flow, a movement that certainly no longer makes sense in a place where water has disappeared. The search for meaning is one of Jusant's themes. A video on Jusant is planned anyway. But in Dome Keeper, the keeper is deprived of their own space, physical space, since the dome is tiny and the underground can only be accessed by emptying it. Incidentally, it's not a living space, and psychological space because of their solitude. They have no human interaction. Cameron Paxton's score attempts to give them back sage space, using this idea of sonic depth, particularly in the piano pieces, the assessors. For example, Somber, a piece in which the sound of the piano, whose source is clearly close to us, then seems to get lost in space, an effect found in many other pieces. Sometimes it seems as if the composer wants to show that space is precisely what's missing, as if more room were needed for the sound to resonate fully, like in this passage from the Assessor's title track. At other times, the sound even seems a little saturated. The result is a strange sensation of an artificial space. We are torn between the sound recording, showing the proximity of the instrument to the point of hearing pedal effects at times, so close that we could even touch it, play on it, that we could invade the keeper's space, make it our own, and the immense volume it occupies, rather that it wants to occupy like a completely artificial reverb, the desire for a space of which the keeper has been deprived, a space that they can certainly regain, but which ultimately always has a limit, at least in Relic Hunt. The mind is not infinite. We could also see the contrast between the intimate, the inner world, and the planet, the outer world, as in layer by layer. The piano seems prepared, muffled, yet another depth is suggested. But this outer world is paradoxical. The real outside, the surface, is inaccessible as we've seen, and it's only inside the planet, underground, that the Keeper can touch on their own inner world. This management of the volume, the desire to fill the sonic space, can also be analyzed as a musical metaphor of the fear of emptiness. The mind isn't necessarily empty, at least not completely. You don't have to destroy every block, but it is nevertheless a question of emptying. The hero creates their own physical space in the mind through emptiness, and the solitude refers to the emptiness of what I've been calling their psychological space. And it's precisely in A Moment to Breathe that this fear of emptiness seems to disappear, at least at first, thanks to the more condensed sound. The space is clearer, less crowded, in addition to a particularly gentle choice of tones and the absence of ostinatos, recurrent in the OST, which I'll discuss in the next section. The thematic elements associated with the Keeper's constraints briefly fade away. I've talked a lot about the importance of time, and we'll see a little later how Cameron Paxton's music illustrates this issue, which is also multifaceted. Time spent on this planet, it's also time spent away from another. Dawnkeeper's two soundtracks take up the themes shared by the two playable characters, but they have their own personalities about which we know little other than the way they apprehend the mind. They engineer their toil and systems, anchored in a relative realism, but more so than the mysterious assessor to whom we can't associate anything real. They don't look human, they levitate their resources. We don't have the same view on each of them, and they themselves may not have quite the same view on their mission. Their constraints in the mind differ. Each soundtrack is thus characterized by its general sound, audible from the very first note, to the point that both characters have their own menu loop, the same piece in a different orchestration, if I may say so. More than in any other game, this loop therefore acts as a portal. It's not uncommon for a menu loop to be narrative on its own scale, announcing the musical color and more generally the sound color, if we include sound design, of the work, which can also help us grasp some of its themes even before the game begins and beyond potential leitmotifs. Assigning a specific color to each playable character is, more than it usually is, a way of making this music, bearer of expectation, a portal to the game, more precisely to the Keeper here, just as Dawnkeeper's music is a portal to what the character is experiencing internally. It's worth noting, however, that the loop doesn't change as soon as you change Keeper in the settings. It's when you return to the title screen that the loop of the last character selected is played. I find it very effective in terms of portals, precisely because of its characteristic motif in fifths, a very simple but highly recognizable element that runs through the piece. The Engineer's soundtrack was essentially composed with virtual synthesizer pigments. It is rich in terms of tones and accompanies the exploration of a planet unknown to us in a way that's quite obvious. That might be a bit of a leap, but when you launch Doomkeeper, you don't expect to hear a string quartet or a wind quintet. That's normal, just as you'd be a little surprised to hear In Wonderment of Winter in Talonfor's Phendrana Drifts. The Assessor's music makes notable use of the piano. It's an instrument I'm extremely familiar with. I've listened to a lot of classical piano music for a long time, and although it's not a Chopinian piano here, there are filters and it almost sounds prepared sometimes, it seemed so unexpected in the context of the game that its use reflects two things for me. As the Assessor is a bit strange, they don't seem human. Using a rather classical instrument in a context that is not, or at least in which it isn't expected, not with this importance and treatment, induces a form of distance between the music and the universe, which may initially reflect the character's otherness. They're not as we'd expect them to be, neither is their music. It stands in stark contrast with the usual soundscape in this kind of universe. Above all, as I listen to the Assessor's soundtrack again and again, my familiarity with the piano, how comforting it is to me, coupled with the distance it creates with the Engineer's music, clearly convey the composer's intention that the Assessor's music should be associated with their inner world, while the Engineer's translates the way their surroundings are affecting them, to use Cameron Paxton's words. The piano stands out and becomes, for me, the Assessor's voice. The use of a specific instrument with yet a lot of diversity makes it easier for us to connect it to a particular character, perhaps not to the point of representing them, as it is common to choose an instrument to represent a character, an ID. The piano's speech is not necessarily always that of the Assessor, but I find it easier by this choice, and by the choice of specific musical phrases too, to lend a voice to the Assessor, yet the physically most mysterious keeper, than to the Engineer. But even though the two keepers have their own gameplay and personality, their mission is the same. While each OST has its own sonic identity, they obviously share common ideas. This may be shown through an identical structure, the end of a Relic Hunt run has the same musical structure for both keepers, or we may find the same motif from time to time. However, these similarities are not so much motivic, at least that's not what struck me, as they are structural. First, there's time management. Doomkeeper's music is generally slow without losing its pulse. Very often, an element will clearly indicate this, be it an ostinato or the rhythm of the initial thematic elements. Even in the most active piece, Caves Beyond, although the multiplication of the lines brings a welcome liveliness to the counterpoint, we can never speak of frenzy. We can therefore see the duality of time, long by the repetitive side of the keeper's work, although their mission evolves and they need to organize, but we mustn't give in to weariness from the point of view of the keeper, not the player who's in more of a hurry, and forget about time because the dome would be in danger. For example, Lost in the Mines is slow in 5/4 and its initial ostinato lasts 2 bars, 10 beats, with long rhythmic figures. It's long but very framed. The ostinatos, particularly the more melodic motifs, although they are also rhythmic ostinatos, can illustrate this organization, which may sometimes verge on isolation, confinement, as much as it allows, through its predictability, to let one's thoughts wander. Further underneath illustrates this quite well. The entry of the different voices is very pure, very clear, and we also find this idea of not giving in to the planet's long time through a precise rhythmic framework. There's a bass that sounds almost like a cantus firmus at the beginning, but the note values aren't too long, it's never longer than a whole note. Then a much more melodic line escapes, an element that certainly has its repetitions while sounding almost free on top of this very constrained background. We hear triplets, which is very surprising given that the engineer's rhythmic context is mostly simple meter. But the keeper isn't really free and their time in the mine is always limited. These elements quickly disappear. Moreover, if we listen again to Lost in the Mines, but we also heard it in Further Underneath, regularly all the layers stop almost at the same time, leaving a fairly long silence before one of the ostinatos resumes. I find these moments quite striking, if not symbolic. They evoke ineluctability and interruption of the suspension of time. Since the melody is inscribed in time, a musical time structured by the pulse, the command silence suspends this flow of time in a way. We are less aware of it, we can lose the pulse, and the return of the sound feels like something inevitable. In this respect, the first part of Vestigial Eye takes advantage of its irregular meter, the beginning works in 14-bit cycles, to accentuate this suspended effect. The new bar begins almost when you no longer expect it after a 5-bit note. But the feed is different from the previous pieces from the Engineer's OST, thanks to the softer sound of the piano, this rhythmic game due to the division of the bar, and the appearance of more melodic motifs in the counterpoint, often in stepwise motions, which soften the initial ostinato essentially focused on rhythm. This way of playing with silence can be applied to a whole piece, as in the beautiful Alchemy. It opens with very fluid arpeggios in a flow softened by the decrescendo due to the echo, joined by other more melodic lines. Gradually, the silences, more precisely when the note fades out, the release, take up more and more space, becoming much more suspended. Contrast is all the stronger in the final section when the counterpoint becomes richer again, even more so than at the beginning, all in repetition, like a revival after a moment of reflection, of doubt maybe, even though the motifs are often melodically ascending overall, which tends to make me think of a form of expectation, of hope, of aspiration. The Assessor's OST is moving as it elegantly underlines the Keeper's multiple, probably contradictory emotions with the efficiency typical of the entire Dome Keeper soundtrack. Indeed, all the musics last around 2 minutes and they're quite rare in-game. It's different than listening to the OST in one go. So you need to be efficient when stating the thematic elements, particularly in terms of color, and this is especially true for the Engineer, whose music has a wide variety of tones. The pieces aren't complex, but there's a fine research of very precise, very strong sonic imprints, even for the Assessor, although their OST is more condensed, still from the point of view of the color. This need for efficiency goes even more for moments of victory or defeat. Particularly for the engineer, the endgame thematic elements feel very concrete and immediate, and their sharing a common key, E-flat minor, really connects them like the two sides of the same mission. In particular, Collapse is based on a very distinctive musical element. The melody is treated with vibratos of different speeds, reminiscent of the beats you hear when two identical instruments tune up and play at slightly different frequencies. You can hear this very clearly with flutes. It's not an organic vibrato that would be part of the sound, but a completely mechanical effect almost beyond our control. Despite the very clear exposition of its main melodic elements, since there is no introduction to speak of, there is then very little evolution. There is unfortunately nothing to celebrate. The dome is lost. On the contrary, Victory is celebrated with Laser Party much longer than the previous one, which allows for a more elaborate construction, where Collapse has a bit of a one-shot feel. It's a moment of satisfaction that you have to take the time to relish. For the Assessor, we find this difference in structure again, although the music associated with defeats, all too familiar, is longer and has more thematic elements than Collapse, with that short, softer middle section, reinforcing the ever more personal character of this keeper's music. The victory music, the perfect bounce, illustrates, just like Caves Beyond but maybe less literally, the assassin's mining technique. The connection with the keeper is again a little stronger than for Laser Party. The music must also illustrate the different stages of the keeper's mission, their techniques for the assessor, their emotions, sometimes adding a touch of lightness to gravity, or, on the contrary, disturbing their fragile tranquility. The music is not all dark, but it is quite profound. If the music's length and function requires efficiency, it's not a matter of conciseness in that the thematic material has time to develop and even change. The return to the mine allows the keeper's thoughts or feelings to pick up where they left off, but their serenity is probably relative. It's not uncommon, therefore, for a change to take place halfway through. For example, if we take Vestigial Eye, we have this first part based on a rhythmic game that is nonetheless quite gentle. But it is then completely abandoned in favor of something much more tense. We also saw earlier that silences can sometimes, paradoxically, invade the musical space, strongly altering the speech. I'll come back to one last example at the end of the video. As I said earlier, Cameron Paxton wanted to translate both the way the planet affects the engineer and the inner world of the assessor. It's true that using the piano in each of the latter's pieces very easily connects us to them, while the engineer's OST depicts both the planet and the way the engineer receives it, as it were. I previously spoke of ostinatos, structuring the flow of time and recalling the organization in tasks as much as the isolation from which the keeper is trying to escape. Some tracks are more ambient, like Between the Waves, which acts for me like a kind of immense sonic wave filling the space and disappearing like a very fast reflux, where we can yet find more melodic elements. Delving works in a similar way. But the evocation can be more concrete, as in Lost in the Mines, which again brings to mind the beats we heard earlier in Collapse. Here it's very concrete to the point of suggesting actual machines at times. In fact, some parts of the piece are reminiscent of the buzz or hum of an electrical appliance. On the other hand, nothing in the assessor's music seems to describe their environment identical to the engineers. It would be redundant for the music to evoke it again. The most descriptive elements are associated with the mining, the part of the gameplay that's Skipper related, and much more interesting rhythmically, highlighted in Caves Beyond. By superimposing a 7-bit rhythmic ostinato, 3+4, and another 2-bit ostinato, it creates a shift that may recall the shifts of the rebounds. They are necessarily increasingly spaced out, hence the idea of desynchronization, particularly when we see two spheres close to each other shift. But keeping the rhythmic patterns unchanged rather than an accelerando or decelerando that would translate what we actually see in-game helps suggest the Keeper's mastery. The music feels very stable despite said shifts as you get used to them, and the faster counterpoint that appears in the second half reinforces this feeling of control and serenity, the multiplication of kinetic spheres and bounces, the possibility of destroying several zones at once, this double mastery of space and time that can make you forget the fragility of the mission. For a while only, bounces lose their strength, spheres disappear, echoes become blurred. The rest of their OST is nonetheless introspective. There's something more verbal, more talkative, and more fluid about their melodies. I'm thinking in particular of Lonely Job, which superimposes on a very defined rhythmic bass, recurrent in the score, a very melodic right hand that develops at length as if improvised during the first half of the piece. It disappears in the second half, giving way to short motifs. The beginning could easily be felt as the assessor's speech through the fluidity of the piano's right hand, its rhythmic variety, and the care given to articulation. Now the speech doesn't really evolve anymore, almost sounding like exclamations, perhaps tinged with resignation. Then it briefly resumes before the piece ends almost unresolved. It's too gentle to feel brutal, it's sudden, like a realization. Incidentally, for pieces with definite endings, that aren't fade-outs, I mean, they often end a little strangely, abruptly without being completely so. In the darkness of the mine and the tiny volume of the dome, all light, all speech fades a little too quickly. Earlier, I mentioned the loss of meaning of the keeper, particularly in relic hunt mode, even beyond the stretching of time due to the superimposition of cycles of different lengths, the long time of the planet and the short or very short time of the gameplay. The growing importance of combat can give the impression of a radical change in the mission. Resources are no longer collected for themselves, in any case they are destroyed in the dome, but with a view to confrontation that is organized on one side of the dome as well as the other, the relic bomb being usually activated since the last wave is so difficult. We don't know what the Keeper does afterwards. Eternal Dust reminds me a lot of this theme. Once again, Cameron Paxton succeeds in creating an immediate sonic interest, here through the choice of an almost literal counterpoint, punctum contra punctum, note against note, with a few exceptions reinforced by the choice of fairly extreme registers. A second sound element corrupts the piano, first its sound, then its speech, as the piano's thematic elements gradually disappear. The left hand merely punctuates the right hand's interventions. The initial theme is stated once more, but it soon becomes clear that it's disintegrating. There are gaps, the corruption layers take up a little more space, and then nothing. Can we see in this a form of alienation, the loss of bearings I mentioned earlier? Or perhaps the fear of oblivion? In addition to sonic space, there's also temporal space. In response to the time constraints, we easily feel a certain urgency as the wave of enemies approaches. Cameron Paxton uses rather slow tempos as we've seen, and most of all slow melodies, calling for attention, memory almost, the silence that forces us to remember the previous note, to keep the imprint of the melody in our head. But fortunately, there's the organ, the beautiful organ that sometimes fills, again and again, the silence, the emptiness, sustaining the sound so that we don't forget. Perhaps that's what might worry the Keepers: memory. The only connection they still have with their planet is the resources they send. Besides, in the other game mode, once the relic has been obtained, we don't know what happens to them. And if they don't get back to their planet in time, or if they take too long to find the relic, perhaps they fear they'll be forgotten, and when the time comes, when the dome proves too fragile and disappears in a rain of glass, they'll be left there with no dome left to keep, no dome left to protect them. Thank you for watching this video. I really thought I would make something shorter than my usual format. It didn't work out, so it was more work than expected, but I really enjoyed immersing myself in the mission and the thoughts of the two keepers. So I'm finally going to be able to start releasing the first analyses in French this time, but it's very likely that I re-record some of my English voiceovers. I'll also take the opportunity to go back over some scripts and complete them. And after that, or maybe at the same time, I'm still not sure, as planned, L'Étonnel Mestiu, Jusant, The Last Guardian and Celeste. Okay, thanks again, and goodbye!